What's up, photographers? In this video I'll be diving into aperture, which is one of the key elements of the exposure triangle, along with shutter speed and ISO that every photographer should know. In fact, knowing how to use your aperture opens up the endless creative possibilities, whether you want to capture bokeh in your images or capture a scene with everything in sharp focus. If you want to learn what an aperture is, how to use it, what an f-stop number is, and lots more, then keep watching. Let's dive in. Aperture in photography refers to the opening in the camera lens that controls the amount of light that enters the camera. It is measured in f-stops, such as f1.8, f4, f8, and so on. We'll be diving more into f-stops in the next section, but essentially the lower the f-stop number, such as f1.8, then the wider the aperture, allowing more light to pass through. Conversely, the higher the f-stop number, such as f8, then the narrower the aperture, allowing less light to pass through. Oftentimes, you'll hear photographers use slang such as shooting wide open. This would mean photographing at a low f-stop number, which widens the aperture. In simple terms, aperture is like the pupil of your eye. Just like how your pupil dilates or constricts to control the amount of light that enters your eye, the camera's aperture controls the amount of light that enters the lens. By manipulating the aperture, you can influence the exposure, depth of field, and creative effects in your images. As we'll touch on later, this allows for greater creative control and freedom over your image composition. In order to understand aperture, you must also understand what an f-stop is. In photography, an f-stop is a numerical value that is used to represent the size of the aperture opening in your camera lens. The f-stop number is also sometimes referred to as the focal ratio or f-number, with each number indicating a different aperture setting. As we touched on earlier, the f-stop scale may seem counterintuitive, but the smaller the f-stop number, such as f1.8, then the larger the aperture opening. The bigger the f-stop number, such as f16, then the narrower the aperture opening. You may think this is a bit confusing in the beginning, like I did when I first learned about aperture, but you have to remember that f-stop values are actually just fractions calculated by dividing the focal length of the lens by the diameter of the aperture. As we'll touch on later, understanding f-stops is crucial because when referring to aperture in photography, we speak in terms of f-stops. You might be thinking every focal length of a lens is different. That's true, and that leads me into my next point. When it comes to the aperture settings, it's important to note that different lenses may have different maximum and minimum f-stop values based on the type of lens that it is. Oftentimes, when referring to lenses, photographers will use the terms such as maximum aperture or minimum aperture. The maximum aperture of a lens, also known as the fastest aperture of that lens, refers to the widest opening of the lens, allowing the most light to enter the camera. On the other hand, the minimum aperture, also known as the slowest aperture of that lens, refers to the narrowest opening of the lens, allowing the least amount of light to pass through. For example, prime lenses, such as a 50mm prime lens, have a fixed focal length, allowing for a wider maximum aperture value, such as f1.8 or even wider, making them ideal lenses for portraits, headshots, product photography, or other types of photography where a shallow depth of field is often wanted. On the other hand, zoom lenses, which have variable focal lengths, may have narrower maximum aperture values, such as f3.5 or higher, depending on the zoom range, making these types of lenses more ideal for a wide range of photography genres. In short, the difference in aperture values between prime lenses and zoom lenses is primarily influenced by the focal length and the optical design of the lenses, with prime lenses typically having wider maximum aperture values and zoom lenses having narrower maximum aperture values. However, it's important to note that advances in lens technology have led to the development of zoom lenses with wider maximum aperture values known as fast zoom lenses, which can offer similar low light performance and depth of field effects similar to prime lenses. In order to truly understand aperture, a photographer must also know the other elements of the exposure triangle. Aperture is one of the three fundamental elements of the exposure triangle, along with shutter speed and ISO. I have a whole separate guide on everything you need to know about ISO, so be sure to check that out. All three factors, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, work in union to balance out the exposure in the image. Now that we've covered the fundamentals of aperture in photography, let's take a look at all the reasons why aperture is important in photography. As I've touched on earlier, aperture is one of the three factors that determine the exposure of an image, along with shutter speed and ISO. By adjusting your aperture, you can control the amount of light that enters your camera, which will affect the overall brightness of your image. A wider aperture will allow more light to enter, resulting in brighter images, while a narrow aperture will allow less light to enter, resulting in darker images. Understanding the aperture will give you precise control over how you choose to expose your images. Aperture also affects the depth of field in an image, which refers to the area of the image that is in sharp focus. With a wider aperture, you will create a shallow depth of field where the subject will be in sharp focus while the background is blurred. This is great for adding emphasis to your subject and creating a pleasing separation between the subject and the background. On the other hand, with a narrower aperture, you will create a deep depth of field where both the subject and the background will be in focus. This type of depth of field is great for landscape photography or street photography when you want everything in the scene to be in sharp focus. Aperture also contributes to the creative effects and aesthetic appeal of a photograph. For example, by intentionally selecting a shallow depth of field, you can introduce bokeh or starbursts into your image. These creative effects can add further visual interest to your image and allow you to add your own artistic style to your image. We'll be covering more creative uses of aperture later in this video. Lastly, different lenses have different aperture capabilities, commonly referred to as the maximum aperture or fastness of the lens. When choosing a new lens, understanding the aperture capabilities of your lenses helps you make informed decisions when choosing lenses for your photography situations. Before diving into knowing what aperture to use, let's take a look at some common aperture/f-stop values. These are considered wide apertures and are most commonly found in prime lenses. By setting your camera to these f-stop numbers, you will allow a significant amount of light to enter the lens, making it ideal if you find yourself in a low light situation or if you want to create a shallow depth of field for blurred backgrounds and subject isolation. This aperture range is often used in portrait photography, street photography, headshot photography, and product photography in order to achieve that creamy bokeh look and emphasize the subject. These are considered mid-range apertures and are commonly used in various photography genres such as landscape, architecture, street, and product photography. These f-stop numbers provide a balance between depth of field, control, and overall sharpness, allowing you to have a wider area of the image in focus while still offering some creative control over background blur. These are considered narrow apertures and are commonly used in situations where you need a deep depth of field, such as landscape photography. These f-stop numbers allow for a larger area of the image to be in sharp focus, resulting in a greater depth of field. The only caveat with these f-stop numbers is that it may require a longer shutter speed or a higher ISO setting to compensate for the reduced amount of light entering the lens. Now that we know the common aperture and f-stop values, let's take a look at how to know what aperture to use based on your given scenario. The first point to take into consideration is to think about your desired depth of field. As mentioned, aperture directly affects the depth of field, which is the portion of the image that appears in sharp focus. A wider aperture, such as f1.8, will result in a shallower depth of field, creating a blurred background, which is great if you need to capture portraits, headshots, or products where usually the subject is the main focal point. A narrower aperture, such as f16, will result in a narrower depth of field, allowing for everything in the setting to be in focus, which is great if you need to shoot landscape photography or group photos where everything needs to be in focus. The second point to take into consideration when knowing what aperture to use is to think about your subject and background. An easy way to think about it is that if you have a single subject that you want to emphasize, then you may want to opt for a wider aperture. If you have multiple subjects or focal points you want to emphasize, then you may opt for a narrower aperture. The third point to take into consideration when knowing what aperture to use is to assess your current lighting conditions. Knowing how to balance all three elements of the exposure triangle is crucial during this step. The available light in your shooting environment plays a vital role in determining the appropriate aperture to use. In low light situations, you will most likely need to use a wider aperture to allow more light in. For brighter conditions, you can use both a wider and narrower aperture, but you'll also have to tweak your ISO and shutter speed settings to ensure you don't end up with an overexposed image. The fourth point to take into consideration is the characteristics of your lenses. Depending on what lens you are using, you'll need to know your maximum aperture value or the fastness of your lens. For example, if you only have a zoom lens that reaches an f-stop value of f3.5, then that may not be the best lens choice if you want to capture a portrait photograph with that bokeh background look. The fifth point to take into consideration is the shooting mode that you are currently using on your camera. In manual mode, then you have full control over the aperture setting, and that is the best mode to control all three elements of the exposure triangle. If you still don't know the ins and outs of manual mode, then you can also use aperture priority mode, which will set the desired aperture, and the camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed for proper exposure. In program mode or auto mode, the camera will select the aperture for you based on the scene and lighting conditions, and these modes will give you the least amount of control. Now that we know how to choose the correct aperture based on different scenarios, let's dive into some creative uses of aperture in photography. The first and most popular creative use case of aperture control in photography is with bokeh. A wide aperture, such as f1.8, can create a shallow depth of field, resulting in a blurred background while keeping the subject sharp in focus. This effect, known as bokeh, can add a dreamy or a romantic quality, creating a sense of separation between the subject and the background, and draw attention to the main subject. The second creative use case of aperture control is with selective focus. By using a wider aperture, you can selectively focus on a specific part of your subject while blurring the rest. This technique is great for isolating a specific detail, such as a person's eyes or a flower petal, and creating a focal point that stands out in the image. The third creative use case of aperture control is with the introduction of sunbursts and starbursts. Using a narrow aperture, such as f16 to f22, and positioning the sun or bright light source in the frame can create a sunburst or starburst in your image. This is due to what's called diffraction, and it occurs when light waves pass through a small opening, such as the aperture of your camera lens, and bend or spread out. At narrower apertures, the small size of the aperture creates a high degree of diffraction, causing the light waves to spread out and create the characteristic rays or spikes that are commonly associated with sunbursts and starbursts. The fourth creative use case of aperture control is with silhouettes. By intentionally underexposing a subject against a bright background and using a wider aperture, you can create silhouettes that emphasize the shape and outline of your subject. This is a creative way to add a sense of mystery and drama to your image. In summary, while aperture is a technical setting, you can also use it creatively as a tool that will allow you to add further depth, mood, or visual impact to your images. In conclusion, the best way to learn aperture is to really just go out and practice it and see how it interacts with the other two elements of the exposure triangle, which are shutter speed and ISO. With that being said, go out and practice your aperture, trying out different f-stop numbers. And if you found this video helpful, be sure to give it a like and leave a comment down below. And I'll see you guys next time.